Hi everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. My guest today is Dr. Rebecca Goldstein. She is an American philosopher, a novelist, and a public intellectual. She is also a MacArthur Fellow and has received the National Humanities Medal of the US, the National Jewish Book Award, and numerous other honors. She is also the author of 10 books, both fiction and nonfiction, including The Mind-Body Problem, Betraying Spinoza, and Plato at the Googleplex. Dr. Goldstein, thank you a lot for accepting the invitation.
My pleasure.
Okay, great. So I usually don't ask personal questions to my guests, but because it's you in this case, I would like to first ask you, because you grew up in a Jewish community, what was the first thing you had contact with, either scientific or philosophic, that really made you question the ideas you were born with? You grew up with?
Yeah. So my family, yes, they were religious Jews. My father had come from Poland. I come from a very long line of rabbis. My father, my grandfather, and as far as we can trace back, 12 generations. And my older brother, is a rabbi as well. And my nephews. I mean, it's a very rabbinical family. And yes, I first of all, I adored my family. I particularly adored my father. He was my hero, a truly saintly man. And so yeah, I was a believer. My family was poor. My father was a refugee, and so we were very poor, intellectual, and we didn't own any books because we couldn't afford books. And so before the Sabbath on Friday, the Jewish Sabbath begins Friday at sundown, and lasts until Saturday until 3 stars are out. So it's more than 24 hours. We were not allowed to do much of anything. We didn't ride, we didn't write, we didn't, couldn't watch television, nothing, no electricity. And so we read, but we didn't own books. They were too expensive. So before of Sabbath, every Friday I was taken to the library since I was 5 years old, since I could read, and I was allowed to take out any book I wanted. My parents felt that if it's in the library, it's a good book. It won't have any dangerous ideas. So I don't know exactly how old I was. I read through all the children's library very, quickly, and then I was allowed to take out books from the grown-up library. I don't know how old I was. But I took out a book by Bertrand Russell called Why I Am Not a Christian. And my family was fine with it. They didn't want me to be Christian. They were Jewish with it. My mother would always look over a book, and she said it was fine. And in this book is a collection of essays by the great English philosopher and logician Bertrand Russell. There was the first essay was called Why I'm Not a Christian. It goes through the standard arguments for God's existence. The ontological argument, the cosmological argument, the moral argument. And it destroys that. It just goes through. And the one I was most interested in was the moral argument, because, I had already been taking out a lot of books in science, and I saw that there were scientific explanations for everything, and that seemed, just not for everything, but, it was an ongoing process, but we had made so much progress, but still it seemed to me that we needed God to tell us right and wrong, the difference between right and wrong. And so Bertrand Russell's analysis of the moral argument for God, which actually, I don't think he acknowledges Plato here, but it really goes back to Plato and Plato's dialogue, the Euthyphro, that really destroys the theological foundations for morality. It just blew me away. And I ought to say that I was already having tremendous difficulties with believing that there was a good and powerful God, because my family had suffered from the Holocaust, right? My father lost a tremendous amount of family, my mother's family came from Hungary, completely wiped out. And I knew this. I knew these stories, and I knew at a certain quite young age that all the kids in my generation were named after dead children, that we all were named after dead children who had been slaughtered. And it, that was a hard thing to understand, how children could have suffered as they did if God, was in charge and loved us as his chosen and blah, blah, all the things that I had been brought up. It was a hard thing to get your head around. And then when I read Bertrand Russell's elegant, sort of mathematically clean dissection of this argument, it was like, yes, this is wonderful. I don't have to try to reconcile the extreme horror, the moral horror of this world with my religious beliefs. It all makes sense if there's no God, right? Or, if we're, morality has nothing to do with God, if morality is our business for us to think out. That, was, it was joy, really. It was a tremendous joy. It just all started to make sense.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I would like to challenge you for a thing now. That is, I personally also love philosophy, but my entire background is on science. And I'm a science aficionado, and I read all scientific book I can get my hands on. So I would like you to try to convince me, why am I not mad? Because I keep reading philosophy. Why is it philosophy still relevant? And I mean, I'm putting aside now people like Foucault, Derrida, Lacan, because I don't read them anymore.
Yeah, that's it. That's good. I don't read them. I'm interested in a particular kind of philosophy. Whoops. Are we okay? Yes. Okay.
Yes.
It's good. For me, the use of philosophy is trying to get the broadest picture possible. And we get a lot of information from science. And that is, we all have to know this, because science is our best means of discovering what the world is really like, what really exists, and how it exists, right? And that science can tell us this. And that's one of the things that we're trying to discover in our big project, in our big human project of trying to get our bearings in the widest sense possible. I mean, we are the creatures who try to get our bearings. We're trying to figure out where we are, what's the universe like, what are we, how do we fit in with the universe, what's in store with us, what are we supposed to do with our lives? These are the kinds of questions that naturally occur to us, to us as the evolved chimps that we are. Chimps don't try to do this, but we do. We try to get our bearings. And so one of the most important questions we ask in trying to get our bearings is, what is the nature of this universe that we live in? And I say science is our answer. But actually, in order for me to be able to make that claim, that science is our answer here, is our best means of telling us what reality is like, because it is a way of getting reality to answer us back when we get it wrong. That's what the whole empirical methodology is about. Oh, you think that simultaneity is absolute, do you? Well, we'll just see about that, and we test it. And we get reality to tell us, kind of shake us around and tell us when we're wrong. But what I've just said is philosophy of science. I can only justify what I've just said by first of all, I'd have to say that science really is about reality. That is itself a substantive philosophical assertion. there are other views about what science is. Instrumentalism, that it really doesn't ever get us outside of our experience. It's a means of predicting further experiences. But, when we talk about, particles and fields and spin up and spin down, this is all metaphor. We're not discovering the nature of reality. We never really go outside of our experience. That's a view that is very popular among certain scientists, So scientific realism itself can't, let me go back. The interpretation of what we're doing when we're doing science is not answered by science itself. Already I have to step outside and engage in philosophy of science, try to give my arguments, that make the most coherent sense out of what science is doing. And these are the kinds of things that we're doing in philosophy. We're taking science, and then we're taking other questions that we need to know in order to get our bearings, including what is it that we're doing when we're doing science? What is the whole enterprise about? And we're trying to make sense of that. That's what philosophy, I think, is. And I spoke particularly about philosophy of science, but there are other, every field of human inquiry or human concern, there's a corresponding science of that field. So there's science of philosophy of mathematics. I think, was I saying science out? I meant philosophy out. For every endeavor that we're engaged in, every cognitive or behavioral field that we're engaged in, there's a corresponding philosophy of that thing. Philosophy of art, philosophy of religion, philosophy of history, philosophy of science, philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of language, philosophy of education. And we're asking these sort of meta questions about these fields, trying to make sense of them, also trying to reconcile them with our other intuitions. I mean, we come in to this business of being human with a lot of intuitions, like, for example, about free will, science is giving us a lot of information, a lot of data, from neuroscience now, from evolutionary psychology, and it's the job of a philosopher, I think, to take all of this information from science and then trying to see which of our other intuitions we can reconcile with this, what's coming out of the science and which can't. So it's, in general, just trying to get the hang of things in the broadest sense possible. Always using the scientific data. I have no respect, or no interest, I should say no respect of, but I have no interest in philosophy that sort of floats free of science. No, I think, to be a good philosopher, you have to be totally immersed in the science that's relevant to the questions that you're asking. And then to see, which of our intuitions we can hang on to, which are gone, which are actually validated by the scientific data. But that's going outside of the science. And it's something that philosophers are particularly trained to do. We're always looking for internal coherence. That's what we're sort of trained to do. It's different from a scientific training. I went through quite a bit of scientific training, quite a bit of math was my first love, and so that's where I spent most of my studies as a youngster. But it's a different kind of skill that's developed as a philosopher, and I think that for me it's quite it's absurd, and also somewhat painful when I see scientists and philosophers fighting with each other. This is the same project of trying to make sense, the broadest sense possible out of our world that we're engaged in. It's both scientists and philosophers, historians. I mean, there should not be these turf wars. No, this is, or I'm more important. This is ego. This is silly. This is draining energy away, or not. I often find, we all have our different talents, and when you're dealing with people whose great sense of themselves and what makes them feel that they matter in the world and that they're important is their intelligence. It's very hard sometimes if you don't have a particular kind of intelligence, and there are many different kinds of intelligences, to recognize, oh, that might be important too, even though I'm lacking it. That's this is what this is where ego and these quite peripheral issues come into intellectual debates, and they shouldn't be there.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, so it seems pretty clear to me that you hate armchair philosophy, at least with the science we have nowadays. So, on that basis, I would like to ask you, is there something that is an object of, typical object of study from philosophy that, because of the way science is developed nowadays, is completely outside of the grasp of science? So, for example, I don't know, one thing that people usually put outside the grasp of science is the question of meaning. Would you say that something like that is completely outside of the grasp of science, for example?
No, not really. I think that the meaning of life. Do you mean that sort of thing? Because meaning,
Yes.
right? I think in fact that evolutionary psychology has a lot to tell us about our great desire to make meaning out of our life. I mean, why is it that we that life can feel, to say that life is meaningless can be a statement of the greatest despair, and really not wanting to go on, a sign of clinical depression, in fact. Which shows something about the well-functioning human psyche, that we need a sense of meaning to our lives. And I like actually to use very much the word, because meaning to me has a kind of elusive feel to it. I understand what meaning in language means. I don't understand what a meaning in life can mean. I like to use the word mattering, that we need to feel as if our lives matter. I think clearly, to say, look, I don't matter, my life doesn't matter, this is a statement of deep despair. In fact, in the U.S., there's a website run by the U.S. National Prevention for Suicide, and the name of this website is You Matter. You Matter. And I think this is very interesting because, of course, I like this word matter because also of its ambiguity. It means the stuff of which we are made. We are matter, right? Although many people want to deny that, but we are matter. We are, but then there's this word, to matter, to be something, not to be insignificant. So I think that one of the things that really gets to the heart of what we are is that we are the creatures of matter who long to matter. Right, and I think our longing to matter. There is scientific input from evolutionary explanation to explain that. The fact that we are matter, yes, this also I think follows from science. So I think, for me, science it illuminates almost every question that I find a meaningful philosophical question. That is, given the vast scientific knowledge we have at this time, which is always, open to falsifiability, part of what's so wonderful about science. But given what we have at the moment, how do we reconcile these other things that we bring to the table, these emotional things that we bring to these table, these other intuitions that we bring to the table? For example, that I matter, which is part of a well-functioning psyche. How do we reconcile these things? How do we make sense in the broadest way possible? To me, this is what philosophy it does. And so, let me see, are there any questions that philosophers consider that? No, well, no, I think all of these go beyond the range of science, that, you're stepping outside, but what science is telling us is always relevant. And to me, for example, a paradigmatic philosophical question is, what is science doing? Science can't tell us. There's nothing, that's falsifiable here. There's no claim that one makes in philosophy of science that's open to the corrections of reality, and that's the province of science that's going to tell us, make us decide between scientific realism and scientific instrumentalism. So it's, you have to look at what science is doing, but you have to step outside of it to ask these questions. And I don't know, it's not to say that one is more important than the other. It's to say that we desperately need each other and each other's trained expertise. There have been great scientists who were great philosophers. Albert Einstein, a great philosopher, who studied Spinoza very deeply. He was very influenced by Spinoza. But he was a great philosopher because he studied philosophers. He trained his mind philosophically as well as scientifically. So, there are certainly these capacious minds who are wonderful at both. But for lesser mortals, you concentrate on one or the other. I was so bad. So I started in physics. I was such a bad experimentalist. Everything went wrong in the lab. Everything. Once I set my hair on fire. I was just completely hopeless in the lab. And I thought, okay, mathematics, I don't have to go into the lab. That was, and then I found my way eventually to philosophy, which is, where I feel like I thrive. But we, very few of us are good enough to do everything. So division of labor, but working together, right? Working together, respecting each other, and working together. There are so many forces at work right now undermining reason. It's terrifying to be living right now in the United States of America. There are, just really forces that that resent, that don't recognize expertise, that hate reason, right? There's just unleashed emotion and tribalism and, just real. So it's, when there are these arguments against people, all of whom are committed to reason, it's unreasonable. Right? That's unreasonable. Let's use our resources and work together. It just seems to me never has it been more important to recognize the contributions that we all, with our different talents, are bringing to the table.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I would also like to ask you, because just because of what you just said, it came to my mind that I personally have a background on science, and again, I already said this, but and only then did I move into philosophy by myself. I only studied philosophy by myself, never academically. And so I guess that one of the great tools I got from science, and it was very important for me to get from science to philosophy and not the other way around, because science gave me a very important tool, that is to understand that my intuitions are for the most part fallacious. And so if you're trying to do armchair philosophy, you're depending too much on your intuitions, and then you will get a lot of things wrong. I don't know if you agree with this or not.
Absolutely, completely. And the other thing I think that, and of course I made the same trek that you did, starting with a scientific grounding and then going to philosophy. I didn't even know, because I grew up in such a sheltered background, I didn't even know that there were, still philosophers around, that this, another book I got out of the library was called The Story of Philosophy by Will Durant, and it was meant for a popular audience once again. These books are wonderful, for children, questioning children and questioning adults, but it was, I just thought, Plato, Spinoza, the people he spoke about, I didn't think there were still philosophers walking around. Anyway, it was, but I think you're absolutely, I think, a grounding in both is terribly important. And all the philosophers, that I studied with, that I read now, that I respect, they all know science. They all, are deeply immersed in science. So the other thing that's so important for me, and for the beginning, and as it was in the beginning of philosophy, going all the way back to Plato, is that I think it's very important to talk to other people, to air your points of view to those who are trained in critical reason. And that's, of course, what philosophy, as well as science, teaches you, right? To be trained in questioning and the right way of doing it, vigorous questioning, intelligent questioning, forcing you to bring your hidden premises to light. That is so much from the time that Socrates was wandering around making a nuisance of himself in ancient Athens in the Agora. That is so much the methodology of philosophy, forcing people in dialogue. Dialogue is so important. Again, Plato, to acknowledge, to dig up what is probably unconscious, the hidden premises they weren't even aware of because they are so intuitively obvious, it seems, that you don't even see it. You think of it as just part of thinking. And that's another, I think it's so important in this rational dialoguing, which is science and philosophy, very much philosophy, to bring as many different kinds of people into the conversation as possible. When it was all, property white men, for example, certain intuitions were not obvious to them because they shared these presumptions, right? And as, other people are brought into the dialogue, who have had very different life experiences, and so whose intuitions might be quite different, suddenly they're saying, hey, you're assuming this. Justify it to me. Justify it. Tell me your reasons. And that's also how progress is made, so that by talking to others, who may or may not share our intuitions, and to bring in as wide, a diversity of viewpoints into this rational enterprise in order to proceed with towards greater rationality, greater justifiability, greater accountability, right? That's what, that's sort of that we are accountable to ourselves and to others for justifying our beliefs. And but often, it's hard to do it for yourself because you're not aware of of the things that you're presuming. They just seem obvious. Hilary Putnam, a philosopher who had been at Harvard, he had been someone I loved personally as a man and as a philosopher, but he says someplace or other, it ain't obvious what's obvious. And that, yes, it ain't obvious what's obvious. And we often need one another to call us on this.
Mm-hmm. Right. And you already touched a little bit on this, the question I will make now, that is, you already talked a little bit about Socrates and the ancient philosophers, and how by way of challenging themselves and asking for justifications to their beliefs, they led each other to better ways of thinking, let's say. But because it seems to me that their epistemology, the epistemology of the ancient people, let's say, the ancient philosophers, and the epistemology we have now with the scientific method, they seem so far apart, worlds apart even. So, in terms of the content of their ideas, what would you say is still relevant from the ancient philosophers nowadays?
That's a big question. Yes, and let me just say, yeah, you are so right that we have made so much progress since then. And you read certain things of theirs, and oh my God, oh boy, were you confused? Not about the nature of reality, but yeah, just confused about all sorts of things. For example, Plato, they don't think to question slavery. None of that. Not Plato, not Aristotle. The greatest moral thinkers of their day never thought to question slavery. And, So when I say that, first of all, one of the things that I'd say, this is evidence for how wonderful this methodology that they started is, right? If we were not able to look back at them and say, oh man, were you confused? Why didn't you question this? Why didn't you question that? That would show the hollowness of this methodology. They provided us a methodology by which we could make progress and look back at them and say, we know more than you, right? We not just scientifically do we know more than you. Morally, we know more than you. We understand why slavery is wrong. We could give you, and in my book, Plato at the Googleplex, I do, partly trying to explain why philosophy matters, even in this age of science that answers so many of the questions that philosophers tried to answer, and couldn't, because they were, in principle, empirical questions. We needed to be able to develop the empirical means for reality to tell us, no, you're wrong in this intuition, right? But yet that there are still questions that belong to the philosophical domain, even given the great importance of science in our day. And to tell us the answers to questions that we want to know. Also, I wanted to understand why the Greeks invented philosophy, as well as science and mathematics, and mathematics by proof. The Egyptians had really, developed geometry, but this kind of abstract mathematics by proofs, was developed by the Greeks. And why did they also invent democracy, and why did they invent great art that still stirs us today? What was it with these ancient Greeks? But one of the things I do, in order to try to show how much progress we've made, that this methodology works, is I alternate chapters, bringing Plato back into our day, and interacting with us about all sorts of questions. And he's constantly being amazed by how much more we know, not just scientifically, but in the province that he most cared about, and Socrates most cared about, moral knowledge. And and then he's very plain, sort of non-philosophical people are able to elucidate for him. I mean, not professional philosophers are able to elucidate for him, things that we just take for granted. For example, that slavery is wrong, right? Never thought to question this. Now I've totally lost track of what the original question was. What was I talking? What was your original question?
My original question was generally if there was still something relevant about the content of the ideas of ancient philosophers for nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, if you're interested, I'm just sort of fascinated by the ancient Greeks. I'm just fascinated by their culture, why they asked the kind of questions that they did, and why they turned to reason to answer them. I mean, they had a religion too, and their culture was saturated with religiosity, with religious rituals for everything, right? But yet, when they ask these questions of, that I think of as the scientific / philosophical questions, trying to get our bearings in this world, they didn't look to their Olympic gods. They turned to reason, and that's very interesting. That's why they, you find the beginnings of the sciences and mathematics and even history, and philosophy, and because they're turning to reason to answer these questions. And that's, to me, sort of a historical, fascinating question. And so I love to read these philosophers, to see how they went about it. But I would say, to be a good philosopher nowadays, no, we have made progress. You don't have to go back to read, Plato and Aristotle. They have some amazingly wonderful ideas. So, for example, let me say, Plato was always, he had this great intuition that goodness is real. It's not relativism. It's not my view of good, your view of good. That there really is some objective content to this notion of right and wrong and being good. And he tried out many, many different theories of this. One of the wonderful things about Plato that shows that gives light into what it is to be a real philosopher is that he was constantly questioning his own point of view. He went through many different points of view. Towards the end, in the later dialogues, and particularly the Timaeus and the Laws, which he wrote as a very, very old man, his view of what it is to be good is to know the universe, is to he gathered, of course, he was founded the first European university, the Academy, and he gathered to the Academy people who were doing what we would see nowadays was physics. They were or they were studying optics, and they were studying cosmology. Of course, they didn't have the empirical methodology that we have developed, but these were the kinds of things that they were trying to answer. And his answer to this is, the best way of being a good person is to be fascinated by the universe outside of yourself with the beauty of natural laws. I mean, he goes into beautiful sort of almost poetry there about the beauty of natural laws. They got that the physical reality is governed by a small number of laws, and that's beautiful, the elegance of it. And that if your awe is directed outside of your own small, petty life to the grandeur of the cosmic universe, that will widen your perspective, and make you a better person, right? That's actually his last and then he died. He died about 81 or 82. He lived a nice long life, went through many different viewpoints. But that's like his last word to us on what it is to be a good person. Again, it's very Spinozistic, right? Sort of turn the vectors of your attention outside to what is, and that will broaden your inner being. You will not care about the petty things that one is given as a human being to care about it. So, it's. Do I think that this is true? I don't think it's necessarily true. I mean, it's an empirical hypothesis. One would have to go into departments of cosmology and such and see if these are really people who have a wonderful broad view and they are less egotistical than others. And, from the time that I've spent among scientists, some of whom are very great thinkers of our day, I haven't noticed that they're necessarily non-egotistical. I have to say, once again, Plato was being perhaps too optimistic here. But it is a view. I mean, but it's interesting to go and to read the Timaeus. To me, it's fascinating, and to see how he keeps trying to understand what it is that will cure us of our smallness, of our pettiness. And his last word to us is science. That's what's going to do it. Maybe yes, maybe no. But it's just fascinating to me. So I'm personally fascinated by it. Does one need this in order to be a philosopher, to do philosophy? Well, not anyway. So I think you sort of have to, have the training that one gets becoming a philosopher, or by reading philosophy and discussing it with others. I do think that part of, and a very important part is discussion. I have been called so many times on intuitions that I have, and asked to justify them, and struggle and go home and think, and sometimes I give up those intuitions, and I think that we all need that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's very interesting. And I would like to tell you about a concept that we have here in Portugal that I think you will like to know about, and then you can comment on it. That is, here in Portugal we have people, and of course that must also happen in America and other places, people who go to the media and they talk, they have opinions on everything, even on subjects that are outside of their field of specialization, and they make predictions all the time, and they are 100% certain of what will happen. And you know the people who I'm talking about, right? And here in Portugal we have a word for them. We call them tudólogos, and in English it would be something like all logists or everything logists. Like psychologists are specialized in psychology, anthropologists in anthropology. The all logists or the everything logists would be specialized in everything. So there are these sorts of people, and it's very interesting because even though people tend to listen to them, at least a significant percentage of people listen to what they have to say about things, they still make fun of them, because in the end they know that they can know, or they cannot be as certain of the things they talk about as they seem to be when they are on television or something like that. So even in that sense, it seems that even with this concept that exists in Portugal, and probably you have another concept for that there in the US, that it is pretty clear that the mentality of people over time evolved, because it's not as easy as before for people to trust the intuitions of people that present themselves as knowing a lot about everything, like, for example, the sophists did in ancient Greece, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, the sophists in ancient Greece were, our whole, we use the word sophistry now, and it's a pejorative. It's a very negative term. It was not in ancient Greece. That's because of, Socrates and Plato. They had a very low opinion of them, and so the word has taken on this pejorative meaning. But they were really bad in the sense that they would teach you to argue your viewpoint, whether you're right or wrong, that was immaterial. It's not even relevant. Like lawyers, actually. I mean, we have lawyers to do that now, right? They will, take on a client and they will defend them whether they're guilty or not. Well, the sophists were sort of like that, and so their indifference, their high-handed indifference to truth, was what made Plato and Socrates despise them. And see, this is something that we should really value, these ancient philosophers, for that they thought the truth matters so much, right? Which is itself a philosophical viewpoint. Why should the truth matter, right? Why should, if all we're trying to do is survive and flourish, then who cares about the truth? Let's just try to get our way, no matter what. And, and this is a substantive claim. No, the truth really matters. And maybe in just trying to get your way no matter what, you are violating a moral truth. Don't you want to know whether you are? Don't you want to devote yourself to trying to figure this out? And that's the great value to me of these ancient philosophers, that they so valued the truth, were sure it was out there, knew that it mattered, and tried to develop a methodology to help us get to it, so that now we can look back at them and say, gee, we know so much more. Yes, we do, because it was working. Yes, it was working. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I would like to ask you a very specific question, that is, so nowadays we know, particularly from the knowledge we have from evolutionary psychology, that our moral sentiments are evolved entities, let's say. So would you say that the fact that we know that, and as soon as we get to know completely how they evolve and how they work in our minds, that scientific knowledge by itself is enough for us to have a moral system?
No, I think again, that we can explain different moral sentiments that we have, and here in the U.S. there's this psychologist, Jonathan Haidt.
Yes.
He has, isolated, and sometimes he says 5, sometimes he says 4, sometimes he says more, sources, psychological sources for our moral intuitions. And there's, purity, for example. We want to feel pure. And there is, what else is there?
Care, harm, fairness, loyalty, and authority, right?
Loyalty to the group and respect for authority.
Yes.
And so that there is, different moral intuitions that people have, and we have different moral intuitions. That there are these different psychological sources of them. So, for example, in the group that I grew up in, loyalty to the group. Oh my gosh, this was so very important, right? Religious, for the group into which one was born. And authority, very, very important. I come from a rabbinical family. The rabbis were great authorities. You completely kowtow to their opinions about everything. Purity, incredibly important. There are so many laws, religious laws, where I came from, but I think in all religions. Controlling sexuality, for example, in the tradition that I came from, controlling what you ate, right? The whole notion of kosher, non-kosher, this kind of purity, and trying to that the notion of some things being impure and that one wants to, and that one sort of develops a repugnance for things that are impure, which are often developed into a repugnance for people that one thinks are impure. And so, so this is all terribly interesting. And then there's fairness, sort of equality among us, not harming others. All of this, and you can tell, but psychology can tell us all of these. What we need moral philosophy for, moral psychology can tell us moral philosophy for is, and which one of these sources that are feeding into these various intuitions can be justified and which can't, right? So this, respect for authority, loyalty to the group that you happen to have been born into, purity, right? That gets extended in all sorts of ways, including xenophobia, to back up one's hatred of strangers. They're impure. Some of these intuitions lead to consequences that are immoral and cannot themselves be justified, and some can. And for that, psychology can't do the work. You can't get psychology to give those answers. That's where you take what the science is giving us, and then you do other things, philosophical things. You reason about them. What can be justified and what can't? Harm to others? Yeah, I would think, we can offer philosophical justifications of why harm to others is a bad thing, and why fairness is a good thing. That takes a lot of work, a lot of philosophical work. Loyalty to the group, authority, blindly, giving some special people authority, purity. Harder to come up with philosophical justifications for this. I think one can. So if you just stay in psychology, and I have to say that Haidt does this, what you end up saying is, well, they're all good. They're all good. And in fact, he goes so far as to say, look, conservatives, we found empirically, appeal to all 5 of these, whereas liberals tend to appeal to only 2. So in fact, if you just count up, conservatives are better. Right? They're appealing to more of these sources of intuitions. And that doesn't follow. If you stay within psychology, you might end up saying that. It's why you need philosophy. Always together. And I'm not saying that psychologists can't do philosophy. I'm married to a cognitive scientist who I happen to think does very good philosophical reasoning. I don't think that we would have quite the marriage that we do if that were not the case, right? So it's not, I'm not saying that I'm just saying it's a different kind of reasoning. And being good in one doesn't necessarily, and if you don't see that they're different kinds of reasoning, if you think that only one can do, you only think that, that philosophy and the Hegelian spirit can tell you what is, and you don't have to pay any attention to science, you're going to do very bad philosophy. I think. And also, if you're a scientist and you think that the scientific answers one's getting can answer all of these questions, including the philosophical ones, again, you're not going to be a very good philosopher. You may be an excellent scientist, but you're not doing well in philosophical reasoning.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very well. So, Dr. Goldstein, perhaps just one last question. Do you think that in a scientifically dominated world, in a world dominated by science, that human beings are more at risk of falling into nihilism?
I don't know. I mean, nihilism, thinking that there are no moral values. I suppose perhaps that's right. It would be, again, I always want empirical data, It would be interesting to do surveys, right, among the scientifically literate community. Is there, more of a tendency to say that, there's no objective right or wrong or any of that? I don't know. And I do think that would be an interesting empirical question to pursue. But you could think a priori, just without the empirical data, there might be that tendency because of this. I think to think that all of the answers are coming from science, and science is not giving us these answers, therefore there are no answers to be found. There might be more, one might expect more higher levels of nihilism, but that's a prediction one could make on the basis of this reasoning, and it would be, but I think, we should follow it up with surveys of some sort, I know among mathematicians, I've always been very impressed by mathematicians' great sort of a heightened moral sensitivity. I don't know why that is, but I've spent a lot of my life among that, and they're egotistical, of course, and they want, the theorem or the lemma to be their theorem or lemma, and they get very upset if somebody else beat them to it and all. But I've just always felt, just in my personal relations with them, that there was a sort of heightened moral sensitivity. And that is, that's, I spoke about Plato's, I hadn't thought about, but Plato's sort of optimistic view toward the end of his life, that sort of objective truth will open up our smallness, and, crank us open, and there's nothing, I would say, more objectively true than mathematics. It's the one place where we get real proof, right? We don't even have to, ask reality to answer us back, we don't have to put it to empirical tests. And wouldn't it be interesting if Plato was kind of right that, mathematicians maybe, have, because of the high standards of truth that they deal with, have even, sort of an opening up, and an opening up that also allows them to recognize sort of the moral reality of others. I don't know, maybe this is terribly naive, and maybe any mathematicians who hear this are saying, oh my God, this woman has not met the mathematicians I know. They're just as small-minded, as petty as everybody else. But I don't know. As I say, it's an empirical question. It would be interesting to somehow design a questionnaire that could get at real moral sensitivity and offer it to people in, the sciences, the different sciences, offer it to economists, biologists, theoretical physicists, mathematicians, philosophers, social scientists, and regular people, right, and non-academics, right, and see, are there differences here with Plato right in any way? Or is this a priori armchair argument that we've come up with, that in an age of science, people will be very, very cynical and dismissive of moral questions. It's just all a matter of opinion, and we can explain how these opinions evolve, but that's the end of the story. We can't say which are right.
Okay, just to finish this up, let's hope that someone in my audience picks up on those ideas and performs those kinds of experiments and surveys, right, for us to get to know more about this. But just before we finish this, Dr. Goldstein, would you like perhaps to share with people where they can find and follow your work on the internet?
Well, I have a website, which I never keep up. You just reminded me, it's completely outdated. I don't know. I mean, sometimes talks I've given are on YouTube. And what else? I tweet. I do tweet. Oh, so I'm not on Facebook, but I do tweet because my publisher had said, you have no social, media, when the last book was published. And so I thought, okay, but I didn't want it to be sort of a self-promotional thing, like, here's where I'm talking. So I don't know, and again, I think this is an influence of my religious background, in which there was a virtue of sort of modesty. You're not supposed to constantly be promoting yourself and this sort of thing, and maybe especially brought up as a religious woman, this was a very important virtue that was drummed into us, modesty. And so I'm still very uncomfortable with that sort of thing. So I decided to tweet as Plato. And so the handle is Plato on Book Tour. And, it's the whole thing again of, Plato back in our time and commenting on various things. But, as things have heated up so much in world politics, U.S. politics, but world politics as well, I guess I've dropped more and more this guise of Plato, although he's relevant, actually. I find, many times I do quote him. I mean, he had a real fear of tyranny and a real insight into the tyrannical personality, the kind of person, the authoritarian personality, who clearly is a type. And he was there in ancient Athens, and he was very much studied and observed and analyzed and, and seen as a great danger to democracy, Athenian democracy, by Plato. And so many of the things he has to say are actually, relevant because, today, again, we're seeing the great rise of authoritarianism and would-be dictators and tyrants growing up in the bosom of liberal republics, right, like the U.S. So that's, interesting. So he's, sometimes relevant.
Okay, so Dr. Goldstein, it was a real pleasure to have you on the show. I really love your work, so thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's really, really fun for me to engage with you.
Okay, thank you a lot. Hi everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel last February and I've been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge. Any amount, even $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons, Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Peralga Larson and Lo Guerrero. Thank you very much for all.